options in the B questions. The idea of the B questions is that different options are considered in some detail before a decision is made. If candidates just list the points without explanation, it will limit their marks quite severely. They do not get higher credit for the number of points listed, but candidates will benefit from making fewer points but developing and explaining these points in detail. And when it comes to the recommendation, candidates should not just repeat what has been said earlier. The recommendation should take what's been discussed earlier and use to justify which option is the better option to choose and why the alternative option or options have been rejected. This should be clearly explained and not a decision stated, again, yes or no. There will be no marks just for saying yes or no, it is for the justification of this decision. This is to make sure candidates gain the higher marks. So common errors that are found on paper 2. So to summarise, across all 3 variants, candidates lost marks by not applying their answers to the insert. It was quite sad sometimes when you saw some really good answers that had not been applied and therefore full marks couldn't be awarded. Also, points were sometimes listed. Again, candidates made it clear that they did understand some of the points, but they just listed them and didn't explain them or develop them, and this is required to be able to gain the higher marks. Again, repeating the earlier points in the recommendation. If there's nothing new being said in the recommendation, it's simply a repeat of the advantage stated earlier in the answer, then no further credit can be given. The recommendation should be based on early analysis, and it should be a discussion of why one option is chosen and compared and stated why, or explained why the other option was rejected. It must be clear why one option is clearly better than the other option, or why particular advantages outweigh the advantages perhaps of the other options. And as said earlier, candidates must apply their answers or they won't gain full marks for the B questions. There are now answers for paper 2. So the examples of answers are as follows. The following slide will give you these examples in a similar format to the paper 1 examples. There'll be the mark scheme, a candidate answer that has no annotation, and then the answer that has the annotation showing the mark that was awarded. This slide gives you the mark scheme for question 4A from paper 2-2. Have a look at the mark scheme, and then there will be some slides with candidate answers that follow that you can see how it was applied. This gives you a candidate answer to this question 4A from paper 2-2. Again, read the answer and see what mark you would award. You can now see the annotation for this particular answer to question 4A. This answer explains the possible effects of each of these changes, and the answer is also in context. There's been good use made of the case study and the case material to identify that imported motorbikes are of a higher quality than locally produced bikes, but that most of the customers of this business are poor and therefore may be more attracted to cheaper bikes if prices are lowered after the appreciation of the currency. So as you can see, this was a good answer that gained all of the marks. This is another example of a candidate answer to question 4A from paper 2-2. Again, have a look at the candidate answer and decide what marks you would award. This candidate correctly identifies the effects of both changes. However, there is little application of the answer to the context, apart from repeating the question that motorbikes are imported. Repeating the context provided in the question will not gain application marks. The marks for this answer could easily have been lifted if the candidate had applied the discussion to the business in the context. So as you can see, this candidate only gained 4 out of 8 because none of the application marks were gained. This is a second example of an A question. This is question 3A from paper 21. So have a look at the mark scheme before we have a look at candidate answers. This is an example of an answer to question 3A from paper 21. Again, it doesn't contain any marks at the moment. Read through the answer to see what marks you think this answer should be given. This question required candidates to discuss 2 benefits to CC workers of joining a trade union. 1 mark is available for each benefit identified. 1 mark is available for generic explanation of each benefit. The other 2 marks are for each benefit being explained in the context of the business in the case. Hence, a generic answer, as in the example of the script provided, only achieved 4 out of 8 marks available. Again, applying this answer to a business making camping equipment could have easily raised the marks and might have even gained full marks. So application is very important. This is an example now of a B question, and this is question 3B from paper 22. This is a typical finance type of question that you might find on paper 2. It requires candidates to calculate the profitability ratios from the information given in the insert. Candidates had to make a judgment about whether the owner of the business should be happy with these profitability ratios. Correct calculation of the profitability ratios would have earned level 2 credit, and then level 3 would have been awarded for justified conclusions in the context of this business. Read through the mark scheme before we have a look at examples of candidate answers. This is an example of a candidate answer to question 3B. Again, read through this to see how many marks you think should have been awarded. Then we'll have a look on the next slide at the marks this actually did achieve. This answer contained correct calculations for the gross profit margin, net profit margin, and return on capital employed. The candidate then draws conclusions about the business using the results of the calculations, and conclusions are also in the context of this motorbike business. So what you've got here is a good answer to the question. This gives you another example of a candidate answer to question 3B from paper 22. Have a look at the candidate answer and again decide how many marks you think should be awarded. As you can see from the annotation, this candidate correctly calculates the ratios and gains all the level 2 marks available. That means they can get up to 6 marks for each of the level 2 marks. However, if you read on, there is no real conclusion drawn about whether these results are good or not. There's no real analysis of the results, and there's no conclusions drawn from them. So the candidate clearly knows how to calculate these ratios, but doesn't really understand what they mean. So they'll gain marks for being able to calculate them, but there will be no further credit given. This is a second example of a B question. This time this is question 4B from paper 22. So again, have a look at the mark scheme before we move on to look at candidate answers. Have a look now at the answer to question 4B from this candidate. Again, this particular slide is not annotated, so have a look, see how many marks you would award to this answer before we look on the next slide at how many marks were actually awarded. You can now see the marks that were awarded to this particular answer. This answer contains good balanced discussion of the 2 options A and B, and the explanation makes good use of the information in Appendix 3. This means that the answer gains both application marks and level 2 credit. This is for developing arguments rather than just listing points. The recommendation gives a well-justified choice of option A and a brief reason at the end why option B was rejected. They said advertising to attract customers also doesn't need to be as costly or as vigorous as in the main city because he is the only shop there. To gain full marks, this answer would have needed a little bit more justification of why option B was rejected. Otherwise, this was a good answer. Now there's a second example of an answer for question 4B. Again, have a look through this answer and see what marks you would award. This answer contains good balanced discussion of the 2 options A and B, and the explanation makes use of the information in Appendix 3. This means that the answer to both options gained 2 application marks as well as level 2 credit. The recommendation gives a brief justified